welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr is often seen as the last wife of Henry VIII, an older woman who nursed him through his final years. That isn't who she was. Catherine Parr was born in August 1512, the eldest child of Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green. Catherine Parr's mother, Maud, was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine, King Henry VIII's first wife. The two women were close, friends. The Queen agreed to be Catherine's godmother, and Queen Catherine is who she was named after, meaning that Henry's sixth wife was named after his first wife, literally. Like Anne Boleyn, Catherine had been raised as a Catholic, but at some point turned to Protestantism. When? It's unclear. She lived in a time that admitting she was Protestant, or worse yet, a Lutheran, could get you killed. Sir Thomas Parr was a descendant of King Edward III, and the Parrs were a substantial northern family, which included many knights. Catherine had a younger brother, William, who after much wrangling was later created the first Marquess of Northampton, and a younger sister, Anne, later Countess of Pembroke. Sir Thomas was a close companion to King Henry VIII, and was rewarded as such with responsibilities and incomes. Catherine Parr's parents were good family friends to the king and queen, and employees. But when you are the king and queen, a lot of your friends are your employees, or at least your subjects. They didn't have airplanes, and traveling was hard and dangerous. Your BFF king and queen couple would occasionally make state visits, but that wasn't easy or often. Maud would have been there in 1510 when Queen Catherine had her first miscarriage, and the next year when she had a little baby prince who only lived for 53 days. Maud would have attended the queen through her pregnancies, but as a childless woman, she was probably not at the births. Usually, to attend a birth, you would have had to have had a baby yourself. Childbirth in the 16th century was scary and dangerous, and they weren't trying to scare young girls off. But she would have seen the anguish her good friend was going through. Queen Catherine so badly wanted a baby. It was at this time that Maud found out that she was pregnant with her first baby. I'm sure she was scared. She had seen her friend lose baby after baby, and now it was Maud's turn. During her pregnancy, Maud Parr remained at court, attending the queen. She worked through her pregnancy. I worked through my first pregnancy. It was exhausting, and I wasn't pregnant in the early 16th century. I could drive to work, and there were rules put in place to help me navigate working in a nursing home while I was hugely pregnant. I can't imagine working through a pregnancy back then. By necessity, the Parr family were living in their townhouse in southwest London to be close to the royal court. She did have her baby, who she named Catherine, after her friend, the Queen. The Queen even agreed to be little Catherine's godmother. While I have no doubts that Queen Catherine was happy for her friend, this had to be hard for both women to navigate through their feelings. And I have to stop for a moment to remind you that this little baby's parents were good friends with the king and queen. The same king that she will become the sixth wife of. I don't love that dynamic. Just 3 months later, Maud was pregnant again, something that she would have told the queen, but I'm sure she was apprehensive, knowing what her friend was going through. But everyone was excited to find out a month later that Queen Catherine was also pregnant. Maud and Catherine were going through these pregnancies together. While baby Catherine Parr wouldn't have been at court often, she likely, on rare occasions, would have come to see her godmother, the Queen. Maud had a little baby boy in August, whom she named William, likely after her father-in-law. 1-year-old Catherine was now a big sister. Queen Catherine had her baby the next month, also a boy, but he was stillborn. Around this time, baby Catherine's visits to court would have been more rare. Maud now had 2 babies at home, and quick trips to visit the Queen were harder. Plus, the Queen, while happy for her friend, was also desperate for a child of her own. Queen Catherine was pregnant again just a few months later, when little Catherine Parr was 3 years old and the whole country was praying for a surviving baby. When Catherine Parr was 3 and a half, Queen Catherine had her baby. A healthy, bouncing baby girl she named Mary, and everyone expected sons to follow. The Queen and her ladies would have been so excited for this development, and seeing it as God deciding that the royal couple was now worthy of having babies. But they still needed a boy. Queen Catherine spent most of 1514 pregnant again, and was expected to have her baby around the end of the year. Maud was pregnant with her third child in the latter part of that year. Queen Catherine had another stillborn son in late November or early December. Maud had her baby, a little girl named Anne, the next summer. Catherine's father Thomas died of the plague in 1517, when she was just 5 years old. She was very close to her mother growing up. Her brother William was 4, and her sister Anne was 2. Her mother decided not to remarry, a bold decision for a gentlewoman in the 16th century. This was not the age of girl bosses. She instead turned her home into a kind of finishing school for gentry children. Think of it like a courtly prep school. Gentry, looking to raise their family station, would send their children to be educated by Catherine's mother, a former lady-in-waiting to the Queen. Very impressive for a woman of that time. She was a small business owner. Maud was still friendly with her former boss, Queen Catherine, and Maud's children would sometimes have playdates with the little royal princess, neither knowing that 7-year-old Catherine would someday be 3-year-old Mary's stepmother. Catherine's initial education was similar to other well-born women, but she developed a passion for learning, which would continue throughout her life. She was fluent in French, Latin, a language in which she also composed, and Italian, and began learning Spanish after becoming queen. According to biographer Linda Porter, the story is that as a child, Catherine could not tolerate sewing and often said to her mother that, "My hands are ordained to touch crowns and scepters, not spindles and needles." But this was likely made up, although I like to think of a little girl in the 16th century being bold enough to come out and say it. In 1529, when she was 17, Catherine married 21-year-old Sir Edward Burr, a grandson of a baron. Following the second Baron Burr's death, in December 1528, Catherine's father-in-law, Sir Thomas Burr, was summoned to Parliament as the new Baron Burr. During this time, King Henry was working very hard to get out of his marriage with Queen Catherine. She was not producing a son, an heir for him, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Catherine Parr's husband was in his 20s and may have been in poor health. Catherine's father-in-law was abrasive and abusive. One of Catherine's sister-in-laws had already been kicked out of the household, her children being called bastards by their grandfather. He wasn't a kindly old man. In 1530, Catherine's mother visited and talked her father-in-law into setting the couple up in their own household away from him. His father secured a position for his son as steward of one of his manor houses, allowing Catherine and her husband to move away from her father-in-law and his erratic moods. Catherine's husband seems to have been in generally poor health, and he died in 1533 at around the age of 25, not surviving to inherit the title of Baron Burr. Catherine was now a 20-year-old widow of a knight. Because her husband had predeceased his father, he never became baron, and Catherine never became a baroness, so she had no dower lands or income. She had never been noble, and the couple hadn't had children, so she was left with no inheritance from her first marriage. 20, broke, and alone. Going home meant to live under her brother. She didn't want to do that. Her younger sister was 16 and still unmarried, so she didn't have a household for Catherine to join, as would have been the tradition of the time. Following her first husband's death, Catherine went to live in the household of one of her cousin's widows, but not for long, because she was married for a second time the following year. 22-year-old Catherine married 40-year-old John Neville, Baron Latimer. With this marriage, Catherine became only the second woman in the Parr family to marry into the peerage, becoming a noblewoman, a baroness, Lady Latimer. The 18-year age gap was on the larger side, but her father had been 12 years older than her mother, so it wasn't out of the ordinary for the time. The security that Latimer could afford Catherine was probably a major factor in their marriage. She was seen as older because she had already been married and widowed. And this marriage would ensure her a dower income if something happened to her husband. Security seems to be the thing that she looked for in men from this point forward. He had been married twice, with both of his previous wives deceased by this point. From his first marriage, he had 2 children, John and Margaret, ages roughly 14 and 12 respectively. So she was closer in age to her stepchildren than to her husband. Although Latimer was in financial difficulties after he and his brothers had pursued legal action to claim the title Earl of Warwick, Catherine now had a home of her own, and a title and a husband with position and influence in the north. Latimer was a supporter of the Catholic Church and had opposed the king's first annulment and his subsequent marriage to Anne Boleyn and all of the religious consequences. Because the king could not obtain an annulment from the Pope, he had left the Catholic Church, creating the Church of England. He didn't stop there, though, because in the 16th century England, you couldn't be Catholic anymore. Being Catholic felt like disrespect to the king. The north of England was much more Catholic than the south. It was more intertwined with their lifestyle. In October 1536, during the Lincolnshire Rising, Catholic rebels appeared before the Latimers' home, threatening violence if Latimer did not join their efforts to reinstate the links between England and Rome. Latimer likely agreed with them, but doing so openly would be a threat to his life. King Henry had recently executed his second wife, Anne Boleyn, and the Northern Catholics had hoped that with her gone, King Henry would change his mind and return to the Catholic Church. But he was not a man to go crawling back to a church that had publicly excommunicated him. Catherine watched as her husband was dragged away. Between October 1536 and April 1537, Catherine lived alone in fear with her teenage stepchildren, struggling to survive. Catherine was, at this point, still only 24, trying to raise 2 teenagers and keep the manor house and her husband's barony functioning. She likely had no idea what had happened to her husband and was just hoping she would see him again. It is probable that in these uncertain times, Catherine's strong reaction against the rebellion strengthened her adherence to the Reformed Church of England. In my opinion, this is where she would have started questioning her Catholic faith. Protestantism was peeking out here and there and offering to be an alternative for anyone wanting to reform the Catholic Church. In January 1537, during the uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, another Catholic uprising, Catherine and her stepchildren were held hostage at Snape Castle in North Yorkshire. The rebels ransacked the house and sent word to Lord Latimer, who was returning from London, that if he did not return immediately, they would kill his family. I can't imagine how scary this would have been for the young family. Latimer returned to the castle and managed to talk the rebels into releasing his family and leaving, but the aftermath was taxing on the whole family. I can imagine that they suffered from some amount of PTSD. This again would have affected Catherine Parr's perception of the Catholic Church. But her friend had been put aside by the king, aided by the Church of England, so that option probably wasn't appealing either. The king and Thomas Cromwell heard conflicting reports as to whether Latimer was a prisoner or a conspirator. As a conspirator, he could be legally found guilty of treason, forfeiting his estates and leaving Catherine and her stepchildren penniless. The king himself wrote to Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, pressing him to make sure that Latimer would condemn the villain Robert Aske and submit to our clemency. Latimer complied. Though he may have been Catholic still, he claimed to be on the king's side. Although no changes were laid against him, Latimer's reputation, which reflected on Catherine, was tarnished for the rest of his life. Over the next 7 years, the family spent much of their time in the South. The North had left a bad taste in their mouth. In the South, they were also closer to her brother and her sister. It was here that Catherine became acquainted with, spoiler alert, her future husband, Sir Thomas Seymour. The atmosphere of court was greatly different than that of the rural estate she knew. There, Catherine could find the latest trends, not only in religious matters, but in less weighty secular matters, such as fashion and jewelry. By the winter of 1542, Lord Latimer's health had worsened. He was only 49 at this point, but he lived in a world where there was less medical care or advice to keep people healthy. Catherine nursed her husband until his death the following year. This is likely where the perception of a nurse to aging husbands came from. Her husband John was 49, which was older than it is now. John had decided that he didn't want his son to inherit his estate. His son John was confident, sulking, lying, and oversensitive. Baron Latimer wasn't down with that. In his will, Catherine was named as guardian of his daughter Margaret and was put in charge of his affairs until his daughter's maturity, at which point the estate would be turned over to his daughter. Latimer left Catherine the manors of Stowe House and other properties. He also bequeathed money for supporting his daughter, and, in the case that his daughter did not marry within the next 5 years, Catherine was to take £30 a year out of the income to support her. Catherine was left a very rich widow, but after Lord Latimer's death, she faced the possibility of having to return north. It is likely that Catherine sincerely mourned her husband. She kept a remembrance of him, his New Testament, with his name inscribed inside until her death. But part of that was probably her disappointment of having to return to the north. It likely was not a place she felt safe, especially without her husband. Catherine was now a widow times 2 at the age of 30. Before the death of Catherine's husband, Catherine had secured herself a position in Lady Mary's household. Lady Mary, formerly Princess Mary, and the future Queen Mary I, was at this time 26 years old and still unmarried. She had been estranged from her father from her mother's death until just recently. The king had just executed his 5th wife, and he needed someone to preside as queen over Christmas. Mary had been asked to do it, and it was a step forward in their relationship. Back in her father's good graces meant she needed a household and ladies. Catherine was a perfect choice. Her mother had been Mary's mother's lady-in-waiting. Catherine was 4 years older than Mary, and she had been married and widowed twice, so she had some life experience. She didn't have any children to worry about. She was a dowager baroness and an old childhood friend of Mary. This would also give her the opportunity to see her crush. She had begun a romantic friendship with Sir Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, and the uncle of King Henry's son and heir, Prince Edward. She wrote to him, "My mind was fully bent the other time I was at liberty to marry you before any man I know." Just a few months after her second husband had died, they were already talking about marriage. Thomas had proposed. It was from Mary's household that Catherine also caught the attention of Mary's father, the king, and he too proposed. She now had 2 proposals, and she saw it as her duty to accept King Henry's proposal over Seymour's. And he had beheaded 2 of his wives by this point. It would have been a difficult relationship to navigate. Seymour was given a posting in Brussels to remove him from the king's court. King Henry had been sad, pensive, and sighing. He had been single for over a year since executing his 5th wife. Poor guy, he couldn't catch a break. His wives kept losing their heads. And any kind of real competition was not something that this king welcomed. Catherine married Henry VIII, the following summer at Hampton Court Palace. Henry was by this point a 52-year-old overweight diabetic. He also had open wounds that wouldn't heal, but also hadn't killed him, though they were regularly infected and had to be drained. Catherine was a nearly 31-year-old, widowed twice, but still in good health woman. So when she's portrayed as an old matronly nurse, that's just factually wrong. At 30, well, almost 31, she would have been considering entering middle age, and he was nearly 20 years older than her and sickly. Not to mention, he was the former husband of her godmother, an old friend of her father's, and the father of her friend and boss, Lady Mary. But he was also the king. He had people to caretake him. Catherine was 31 at the time of their marriage. His first 5 wives had been 23, 32, 28, 25, and 17, respectively. But Henry's first 3 wives, had they still been living, would have been older than her. She was the first Queen of England to also be the Queen of Ireland, following Henry's adoption of the title King of Ireland. She was also the 3rd of his wives to be named Catherine. Both his 5th and 6th wives were named after his first wife. Creepy? Probably. But who else can say their 5th and 6th wives were named after their first wife? Probably just him. Catherine and her new husband shared several common royal and noble ancestors, making them multiple cousins. Not first cousins, but I don't know if being 3rd and 4th cousins multiple times is any better. This next part isn't information necessary to retain, but for my family tree fans out there, here's how it goes. This is my favorite part, so please bear with me or skip ahead. You don't have to listen to this part. By Henry's mother and Catherine's father, they were 3rd cousins once removed. And by their fathers, they were double 4th cousins once removed. The short way of saying this is that they were distant cousins many times over, and their shared ancestors were also heavily related. They were both heavily descended from King Edward III, the goat of medieval royalty. A blast from the past. I haven't said that in a while, but I thought the throwback was appropriate. If you have listened to all the other episodes, you may have a broader perspective with which to view his reign through. Edward and his wife Philippa of Hainault nailed it. Philippa is often seen as a little boring because she had done her job so perfectly. You can check her episode out if you want to learn more about her. Back to Catherine. Catherine told Seymour that she had prayed many times to get out of this marriage with the king. As most English people believed the king was the head of the church, if King Henry thought he should be married, then God thought so too. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with friends. If you hated it, share with enemies. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next week, bye.